Hello, good evening, everyone tuning in from the East Coast, and good afternoon to folks in the West and places in between. On behalf of Free Press and the Change the Terms Coalition, thank you so much for joining this webinar on the impacts of online hate. Members of the Change the Terms Coalition are hosting this webinar today. Those groups include Center for American Progress, Free Press, Southern Poverty Law Center, Color of Change, National Hispanic Media Coalition, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Muslim Advocates, and over 50 other organizations. You can find more information about Change the Terms at changetheterms.org. I'm Jessica Gonzalez, and I'm here in LA today, and I serve as the VP of Strategy and Senior Counsel with Free Press, and I'm also a co-founder of the Change the Terms Coalition. We're here today because we know that white supremacists are organizing online at an international scale to bring about white ethno-states and to impede social and racial justice. They're using tech company platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Vimeo to organize, fund their movements, recruit supporters for, and normalize racism, sexism, xenophobia, religious bigotry, homophobia, and transphobia. Today, we'll learn about the impacts of organized online hate and what we can do to disrupt the spread of hateful activities online. So with that said, I want to call us into the humanity of this space. Yes, this is a panel of experts. In fact, some of the most esteemed experts in the US on this topic. And this is also a group of folks who have been either directly impacted by this sort of violent activity or who have had their communities be impacted by that. So I want to emphasize here that Free Press and Change the Terms will have zero tolerance for people who come into the space to spew hatred. We expect that trolls will show up, and we are prepared to remove them if they engage in hateful behavior, which includes but is not limited to use of racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic, xenophobic, or other abusive language or harassment. This conversation is on the record. You can follow along on social media using the hashtag #ChangeTheTerms. So a little bit more housekeeping and then we can get to the good stuff. We'll have time to answer questions at the end of this call. We've received dozens of really excellent questions. I'm afraid we won't be able to get to all of them. We'll do our best and take them in the order they were received. If you have questions at any point, however, you can submit them using the chat function. There's a chat button at the bottom of your screen, and we will have folks both in the Zoom webinar and on the Facebook live feed who are here on behalf of Change the Terms and can answer your questions to the best of their abilities. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. We have Madiha Hussein, who's the Special Counsel for Anti-Muslim Bigotry at Muslim Advocates, and she's joining us from San Francisco. And if the panelists want to give a little wave, I don't know if folks watching the webinar can actually see your names. We can see it, but please wave when I call out your name. We have Brandy Collins-Dexter, who's the Senior Campaign Director for Media, Democracy, and Economic Justice at Color of Change. She's joining us from Baltimore. Hello, Baltimore. We have Jess Campbell, Co-Director of the Rural Organizing Project in Oregon. Hello, Jess. And finally, we have Ana Hernandez, who is here calling in from Chicago. And she's going to share some work that she did as a research fellow with the Political Research Associates. She has done an extensive amount of interviews in the field with individuals who've been subject to targeted online harassment campaigns. So we're going to start off here with a pretty good chunk of time where Anna's going to lay out the findings of her research, and then we'll move into, in about 15 minutes, a moderated Q&A that will feature the other panelists. So Anna, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It is truly an honor to be here with you, Madiha, Brandy, and Jess. As you referenced, I recently completed a research project for Political Research Associates, which was intended in part to help better understand the kinds of threats and attacks by the far right that are faced by people working toward progressive social change. I interviewed approximately 30 people who work across multiple movements for social justice, including but not limited to Muslim immigration, racial, economic, reproductive, and gender justice. And by gender justice, I refer to both movements for the rights of women and girls, as well as across spectrums of gender identity and expression. People also work in anti-violence, specifically addressing sexual and police violence, in rural organizing, and in interfaith organizing. So it was a pretty broad spectrum. Before I begin, though, I do want to address why I won't be using the frame of hate speech, and we'll talk instead about the risks, the threats, and the attacks that people face when they're confronting far-right ideologies. This is because I ascribe to the idea that hate actually isn't the primary goal. It's one of a number of tools that are used to dehumanize not just individuals, but whole groups of people. And that the dehumanization, in turn, is a strategy for, in this case, white nationalist and misogynist political and cultural agendas, which, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. So it's why, for example, you won't hear me talking about interviewees' hurt feelings or feelings of being misunderstood, which, to be clear, they never raised either. You'll hear me talk instead about how these abuses work to silence people, and in doing so, to weaken movements, organizations and movements for progressive social change. So I wanted actually to take a couple minutes to give sort of a case study to help anchor some of the trends that I'll be talking about, in the last few minutes that I've been allotted. I interviewed a young woman whom I will call Ella, not her real name, who with her partner owns a business in the services trades. Ella and her partner and her business partners use their business to support lots of progressive causes in their town. So for example, they offer space for meetings or fundraising events, and they regularly donate a percentage of their profits to different groups. Ella, on her personal time, also attends municipal budget meetings and lots of other public forums in town to state primarily that she believes that her town spends too much money on policing and not enough on infrastructure, and that moreover, her municipality should review the policing practices that it's funding, because her town has actually been in national news a lot over the last few years regarding deadly police violence. When she speaks, she states her name and the name of her business each time because she believes that it proves her level of investment in her community, and it also provides her with some measure of authority. So one of these meetings happened to be in a rather conservative area of town. And there were plainclothes, off-duty, or retired police officers also in attendance. Ella can say that none were in uniform. 48 hours or less after this one meeting, an article about her taking this position was posted on the Blue Lives Matter national blog, which included her name and photo. And in the thread that followed the article, a retired police officer posted her own and her mother's names, addresses, and phone numbers and said, quote, "Go get them," unquote. In addition, Ella described how she was blasted online via Facebook, Twitter, and Yelp, was receiving death threats online and by phone against herself and her 2 children, and how employees were fielding threatening phone calls at the place of business. I just want to point out too that attacks on Yelp that are often in the form of bad reviews will ruin a business's scores. This, and also Ella and her business partners making the decision to take the business line off the hook temporarily in order to avoid the threatening phone calls, had immediate and very significant effects on the business's income. So all of these threats and attacks moved just as quickly into the physical realm. Ella described police cruisers sitting outside the business for hours at a time, which hadn't happened and hasn't happened since the events in question here. And also described people banging on her family's and her mother's homes, doors and windows at all hours of the night. This went on for a good couple of weeks or so. Ella noted that while this experience, Ella, she identifies as white, noted that while this experience doesn't compare to generations and lifetimes of violence and death at the hands of police against people of color, she now understands not being able to seek protection from police. So although the attacks resulting from her comments at this public meeting have since abated, each time the business hosts an event, they see an uptick in online attacks again and protests outside the business. Ella, by the way, lives in an open carry state, and so protesters frequently appear heavily armed. She, her partner, and her business partners are committed to continuing their work both as a business and Ella privately, but of course they remain very worried about how to keep themselves, their families, the staff, and the business safe. So this story was compelling to me for lots of different reasons, including how a person who isn't a full-time activist or organizer and who nobody really knows outside of her hometown was still the target of a national digital attack, physical threat, and police intimidation. These experiences, of course, translate to people who are full-time change makers and truth tellers. The main difference is that the attacks against the full-timers, if you will, are much more frequent and in some cases actually never stop. Another difference is that the attacks against full-timers are sometimes manufactured even. Someone else I interviewed, who I'll call Ida, also not her real name, is quite famous for their racial justice and civil rights work. She's also a nonprofit executive and gave one example of how she was accused by the alt-right of having covered up a sexual assault against an America volunteer years ago at a prior organization where she worked. She took this to heart, of course, as a woman leading an organization working in service to her community. And also the media coverage in the online chatter was so heated that people within her own ranks of progressive movement building started questioning her. And so she took the extraordinary measures of stopping everything, in her words, to find old human resources files, to dig up affidavits, to contact AmeriCorps, to track down witnesses, and hand over all of this information to a national online news outlet with the request to please do a thorough investigative piece on the incident. So what interviewees shared with me is extraordinarily instructive on a number of different fronts. But I'm here tonight to talk specifically about the nature of the threats and the attacks people have faced, the impacts of these threats and attacks, and the fact that all of this together has disproportionate and specific effects on women and gender nonconforming people, people of color, Muslim people, and poor and working class people. Please note that I reference these identities and lived experiences only because these were the ones that were surfaced during the course of the interviews. My failure to reference other marginalized groups speaks, I think, to the fact that a lot more research needs to be done. So with that being said, one of the points or one of the themes that I wanted to draw out are that risks and threats are often very specifically gendered, placing women and gender nonconforming people at heightened risk overall. The slurs and the threats against them target not just these aspects of their identity, but they're usually very violently sexualized and also explicitly against children, mothers, and other family members, as well as people's homes. The responses and impacts to these kinds of attacks are often gendered as well. Women and gender nonconforming people frequently reported fear, anxiety, stress, and a whole host of related symptoms, such as insomnia, vomiting, kidney stones, chronic illness, and so on. One of the second points that I wanted to raise was that risks and threats are often very specifically racialized, placing people of color and similarly religious and ethnic minorities that are assumed to be or associated with communities of color at heightened risk overall. So interviewees described how these racialized risks and threats target specific aspects of their identity, of course, and also manifest in how one is selected for targeting. So for example, Black women are attacked for the same positions or actions that other women and men of color simply are not. The impacts of these threats and attacks are often racialized and frequently manifest in how one is erased. And what I mean by that is that one interview gave a really good example, talking about incidents of sexual harassment and doxing in online gaming culture, and noted that over the course of years, some white women who have experienced this kind of abuse can actually go on to create new careers based on these experiences by speaking and writing about misogyny and gaming culture, whereas the women of color who have experienced the same and or similar levels and forms of violence are often first fired, and then they can't find work, and they cannot achieve success in the same way in terms of unpacking that experience or that series of experiences. I wanted to note that the power of these kinds of threats and attacks based on gender and race relies also on the weight of historical oppression and well-oiled state and non-state systems of enforcement to compound the effects. So, for example, calling a Muslim organizer a terrorist isn't just slanderous, it also brings to mind so many people who have been killed, disappeared, entrapped, surveilled, and imprisoned by the state, and reviled and victimized in so many ways by politicians, school systems, neighbors, media, other institutions. So these words and actions, they have a meaning beyond the dictionary, beyond the law, and they have a weight that is well beyond the interpersonal or the online interaction. Another point that I wanted to make is that these kinds of threats and attacks often have immediate and profound negative effects on people's financial security, which therefore makes it also an economic justice issue. This came out even in just the examples that I gave already in terms of how, Ella's business's income dropped dramatically for a period of a few weeks, and how that influenced or affected staff and themselves. Very few people come to this work of resistance and documentation, dissent, and organizing by way of a profession. They come to it really because there's no choice. So the work often isn't paid well or at all, and it places ongoing strain on relationships and other work and resources, and consequently people enter poverty and risk, or they've lost housing, food security, health insurance, and so on. I wanted to, of course, note that members of marginalized groups are both already much more likely to be poor or working class, and at the heart and intersections of many movements for progressive social change, which makes them especially at risk for both financial instability and the attacks by opponents for their social change work. So all of these factors constitute threats to individuals' safety and well-being, to the continuation and the quality of their work, and as a consequence to the vitality and sustainability of their movements for social justice. This silencing effect is the cumulative cost of far-right threats and attacks on individuals. To sort of restate or recap, if you will, the people who create our movements for progressive social change are already at risk because they're among those who are marginalized in our society and culture. So they're disproportionately targeted and therefore disproportionately bearing the brunt of white nationalist, misogynist, and other far-right ideologies in terms of both who they are and the work that they do. This raises what is, for me, a critical problem of the fact that free speech arguments, which are closely tied to tech companies' free market arguments, are used to protect individuals and groups aligned with the far right, have disproportionately negative effects on the rights and safety of change makers and truth tellers, their communities, the journalists, historians, and storytellers who are documenting their work, and ultimately on, again, movements for social justice. So with that, thank you.
Ooh, Anna, thank you so much for sharing your research. I could listen to you break things down for hours and hours, and I know that you have much more to share, and I hope we get to some of that in the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to move us into a moderated Q&A with the other presenters here today. And I'd like to start with Madiha. This has been a really devastating month with the Christchurch mosques attacks in New Zealand, which made plain how white supremacists are using social media to disseminate their messages and organize acts of violence. Muslim Advocates, of course, was way ahead of this issue long before those attacks. And you're a leading expert on anti-Muslim bigotry online. Can you please share how this is impacting people, you personally, and what Muslim Advocates is doing about it?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me on today for this really important discussion. So you're absolutely right, Jessica, that the Christchurch mosque attacks were sort of a very harsh reminder of the realities of anti-Muslim bigotry and hate violence in general. But in particular, it underscores the connection between on and offline activity that Anna just talked a lot about, and that the companies need to do more to address that very connection. Unfortunately, anti-Muslim bigotry has been rampant online for years. So not only have hate groups used social media platforms to actually organize armed demonstrations outside of and rallies outside of mosques, but we've also seen public officials take to platforms that they have and use their accounts to spew hatred and bigotry that actually creates an environment where Muslims do not feel safe or welcome in their own neighborhoods, in their own towns. And we have also seen that very concrete examples that I'll share. One, for example, when Russian trolls were using Facebook to influence the elections and create division in our country, there were actually examples where individuals from Russia or things that could be attributed back to Russian trolls were organizing, using event pages on the platform to organize both a protest and a counter protest in Houston, Texas, right outside of a mosque. So they've essentially used Facebook as a space to pit communities against one another. And there have been so many similar examples of how these tools are being used in strategic and creative ways to make it very difficult for communities that have already been marginalized and attacked over and over again to ever feel really truly safe, and also to feel as though they're safe on the platforms. So as I mentioned, this isn't a new problem, and it's one that Muslim Advocates and so many others have been working to get technology companies to address for a long time. We've worked with a large coalition of civil rights groups and advocacy organizations to hold the companies to a high standard of accountability and urge them to take significant action to curb the presence of bigotry on their platforms. Among other things, we have worked in coalition with others to ask Facebook to conduct a civil rights audit, for example, and change their leadership structure. We've also pushed some of the larger platforms like Google, Twitter, and Facebook to broaden the scope of their response to extremist violence or extremist content on their platforms by taking a close look at white supremacist and white nationalist content, which I know many of us have been urging them to do as well.
Thank you so much, Madiha. Really appreciate those remarks. And we'll be circling back to you with a few follow-up questions later on in the panel. But right now, I'd like to turn it over to Brandy Collins-Dexter of Color of Change. You all have been on the cutting edge of fighting anti-Black bigotry online. Can you talk about what you're seeing in the context of these struggles? How is organized white supremacy impacting Black activists? How is it impacting you personally? And can you, 5 minutes isn't enough time to describe everything Color of Change is doing on this front, but maybe you can give us a taste.
Thanks, Jessica. As I do this work, I keep thinking back to where it all began for me, maybe in some ways from birth, but in many ways it began on the steps of the state capitol in South Carolina in 2015. I was there to deliver petitions calling for them to remove the Confederate flag from state grounds. I was there because just a week earlier, a man had walked into the Emmanuel African American Methodist Church and gunned down 9 people. I remember I was shaking so hard on those steps as I told the story of my great-grandfather, a sharecropper from Clarksdale, Mississippi, who disappeared after getting into a disagreement with his employer, who refused to pay him for his work. An employer who we later found out was also a known Klansman. I said then that the Confederate flag that flew over my grandmother's head when she was forced out of town and separated from the rest of her family at the age of 9 was the same one waved around by a psychopath whose manifesto continues to fester online. I remember looking out and seeing neo-Nazis holding up their Confederate flags and watching me with hatred as I told that story. Incidentally, I knew they would be there because I saw the Facebook event that had posted about it. Still, it was one of the few times that I genuinely feared for my life. I didn't know then that I would become desensitized to explicit and implicit threats delivered online. The Emanuel 9 killer's family told the public what would become an increasingly familiar story, a story of someone pushed to extremes by overexposure to violent ideologies online. This was something I myself would put to the test when I started using a device that was explicitly for my research on white nationalist communities. I found that when the computer began to read me as a conservative white male, it fundamentally changed my user experience. Hey, you follow Mike Cernovich, Twitter would ask, but have you tried following David Duke or David Horowitz? Amazon would see that I was looking up books about Laura Southern and make sure I knew I could buy Mein Kampf and a plethora of neo-Nazi paraphernalia that could get shipped to me by the next day. I was bombarded with articles on Yahoo and other places talking about dangerous Blacks killing each other in Chicago. I found that my worldview was profoundly shaped by who the internet thought I was. And once I was relegated to that bubble, there seemed to be no way to get out, at least not on the computer. But this wasn't just random. Many of the groups we were fighting against were actively organizing online, often through gateway content, as Anna talked about, including video games, that increasingly push people towards more violent ideologies. Many of these groups were way ahead of the game as early adopters of new technology. When Richard Spencer says the average alt-right person is a tech worker in his mid-20s, he's not just talking randomly, it's all too true. By platforms having loose and often unenforced policies, it gives these groups a veneer of legitimacy that allows them to operate unchecked. They're able to peddle video and audio content on YouTube and SoundCloud, sell paraphernalia and self-published books on Amazon, sell tickets to their events on Eventbrite, harass and seek to intimidate Black thought leaders, disproportionately women, on places like Twitter, and organize violent encounters on Facebook. We went after the financial streams for these groups, working closely with financial institutions and many folks on this call to encourage groups like PayPal to stop violent factions from being able to process credit card payments through our Blood Money campaign. But often this was like playing whack-a-mole with billion-dollar companies depending on us to point them in the right direction, as opposed to investing resources, creating worker incentive models, and expanding enforcement policies to create a new normal on and offline. It felt like we were fighting against this invisible clock, waiting for the next violent encounter, and we wondered how we could put forth solutions to slow down, if not stop, the never-ending countdown to tragedy that would restart after Charlottesville, after Pittsburgh, Christchurch, on and on. We collected stories of activists that had white nationalists show up at their homes or workplace, having been doxxed on Reddit and in Facebook groups. And we noticed something else. Too often white supremacists and those openly threatening us with hostile, hateful, and violent speech were given a pass, while Black voices speaking out against them were silenced. A number of visible Black activists have been censored, their accounts shut down or suspended, and we know from hundreds of stories we've collected that everyday Black people, Black women in particular, get their content and accounts banned for speaking out against racism, misogyny, harassment, and particularly stories of what was happening to them. So this isn't just about stopping anti-Black hate, but looking at all the ways we could make these tech platforms less hostile places for Black people. Now more than ever, we needed to draw a line in the sand for corporations who hold the most power in being able to rein in these threats and deprive it of the digital oxygen it needs to thrive. It's important for companies to understand that staying neutral in these times is in fact making a choice. And this is what brought us to the table to work on Change the Terms. I know we'll cover more, so I'll leave it there, but ultimately, the last thing I'll say is that this is like one tool in a toolbox of necessary interventions in order to ensure that the values of equity, justice, and security can exist for us all. So it's about these policies, and it's also about a lot of the work that we do outside of them. I'll close there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brandy. Very powerful words there. So I'm going to call in Jess Campbell, who's the co-director of the Rural Organizing Project, which is fighting for progressive change in rural Oregon. I know you've experienced organized attacks from the far right, Jess. Can you tell us a little bit about how those attacks played out, how they've affected you and your organization, and the way you engage in advocacy and participate in our democracy?
Thanks so much for having us and inviting us on here. And I really appreciate it as part of our strategy about kind of how we're confronting what we've experienced is shining a light on it, because sunshine tends to be the best medicine for this. So let me start with what the context of our work was that really helped inspire a real right-wing attack of our organization and of me personally. So we, as an organization, have been working across the state of rural Oregon, really working with communities who are on the front lines of various abandonment by the state, including defunded 911 dispatch. That in 2014, which is when all of this kind of started for us, we were seeing that paramilitary formations were really gathering steam and organizing on social media in order to fill the vacuum of a lack of funded state infrastructure on the ground. And it came with a right-wing ideology, and it came with often a thinly veiled white nationalist ideology. And in response to that, and as well as national mobilizations of paramilitary and so-called patriot movement folks to different parts of Oregon, we were called in by communities to help figure out what exactly was going on, see if we could kind of connect the dots between what they're saying and what they're doing, and then help develop some strategies for countering what they were doing on the ground. Often these paramilitaries would show up into already very divided communities where the tactics of threatening people had kept folks very silent. And so they were able to say, we were invited here, we were welcomed here. Do you hear anyone complaining? And that was used as a rationale for them to justify that they have the entire county or community that they were holding hostage as a base, when in fact people were just so desperate for safety that they were unwilling to say anything and were often holding up and hiding at home. So in response to one of these communities, I came out and I spent a week there, and it was clear that our meetings somehow were being monitored, and my plates went out and my car description went out on Facebook. And because much of this organizing is done on social media, we set up a monitoring operation mostly by local folks. And local folks decided to take action. They decided to hold a press conference to really counter this idea that the paramilitary groups had an unclaimed, majority in this community. And that press conference was met with armed militia members and the former county sheriff, visibly intimidating people with weapons, threatening to follow them home, and ultimately interrupting the press conference, which luckily we were prepared for, and were able to say, you think your Second Amendment trumps our First Amendment. Soon after that, my address went out online with an anti-Semitic narrative. It was assumed because I have dark hair and dark eyes that I am Jewish. I am not. I was also labeled a domestic terrorist, and soon family information was getting out on social media, and they were identifying people in my social media photos, including a former partner who was still closeted at the time. So they were going around and trying to figure out where I lived, and eventually did figure out where I live. I live out on a very remote stretch of Cottage Grove. And not only did they go out to my house, often doing so not very stealthily, they did so gleefully, posting fantasies of torturing and raping me, as well as murdering my family and my pets. Soon after, a GPS tracker was put on my car, and it was done, we believe, at my home. And I didn't know it at the time, but I started getting followed everywhere I went, and soon people were sitting down on every little meeting that I would have at a coffee house. I get followed hours sometimes, often by different vehicles, and later I discovered that it was a GPS tracker put on my car. Over the span of 6 months, that kind of vandalism and following of my car kind of amplified. I went to a meeting and discovered that my lug nuts were loosened at one point, which could be lethal. I was going high speeds on a highway when I discovered it, and I also had my fuel lines cut. So there's a lot there with all of that. But unfortunately, my experience wasn't terribly unique in that we have talked to a lot of folks in communities that experience similar levels of threats. And it is really meant to shut down democracy and shut down a plurality of opinions and conversation in civic spaces. And it's often done with that narrative that no one else cares, and so whoever has the most guns gets to make the decisions. We have also seen that many with the means have actually actively moved out of these communities because they refuse to put themselves or their families or their neighbors at risk anymore. In terms for us as an organization, we ultimately had to switch to a strategy of exposing as much as possible. And we obviously had to create new strategies for security within the organization, including adopting a lot of accompaniment strategies that we experienced as doing, it's international solidarity work, including making sure that there were no solo road trips anymore. But ultimately, our best strategy was to expose what was happening with our communities and to be able to bring it back to some root causes, which were to absolutely weaken social movements, as Anna had so eloquently said earlier. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jess, for bringing that in to us here. Thank you for sharing. So we're actually going to do we're going to mix it up and go into a lightning round of sorts, where I'm going to ask each presenter, and we'll go in the order that you originally presented. So we'll go Anna, Madiha, Brandy, and Jess. 2 questions and try to answer as quickly as possible. The first one is, are tech companies doing enough to stop the spread of online hate? And if you could wave a magic wand and eliminate one problem with tech companies that most exacerbates harm for the targets of far-right organizing and hate, what would it be? So I'll kick it to you, Anna.
To the first question, no. And to the second question, since you did invoke magic, I would say if they would switch their allegiances from profit, shareholders, dollars, to people who are using their services and platforms. And in that context, to think about especially what Brandy Collins-Dexter was talking about in terms of who's being persecuted and penalized for exposing injustice and violence.
Thank you, Anna. And I do see questions coming in through the chat. As I mentioned earlier, we will have time towards the end. We have received a ton of questions, and we will do our best to move through as many as possible. If you submit the questions in the chat on the Zoom webinar or in the Facebook Live chat, change the terms representatives are in those spaces to try to answer as many questions as we can. So I'll now turn it over to Madiha.
So in short, no, they are not doing nearly enough to your first question about whether they're doing enough. I think that when we talk about what we would all dream for in an ideal, there are so many things that we could list off, but I really appreciate what Anna said. And I think that it's really important to see systemic change and systemic commitment to wanting to see change when organizations like ours are speaking up and voicing our concerns. More specifically, with respect to waving that magic wand, we are deeply concerned about how event pages and tools like that are being used to organize events in the real world. And that's, again, going back to our concern about how on and offline activity are interplaying with one another.
Thank you, Brandy.
No, they're not doing enough. Honestly, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd probably start by retiring a few people at the top of the food chain. I think the executives running Silicon Valley are either not quite ready for prime time, or they're willfully turning a blind eye to the monster of their own creation. And when you see a culture that is corrupt from top to bottom, it's really hard to see a full-scale shift. I think if I had any juice left in the wand, I'd probably break up tech monopolies like Google, YouTube, Amazon, and Facebook. I think the sheer level of power they possess, removing all alternative competitors, the amount of personal data they have access to, and the cultural norms they've set, have created toxic conditions that have made marginalized communities unsafe on and offline. And of course, I'd also finally make sure they adopted all the change the terms policy framework, but hopefully we don't need a magic wand for that. Fingers crossed.
Jess?
Woo! Can I just say ditto? No, tech companies are not doing enough, and maybe I will go more nuanced to say it seems like it should be a bottom line. It seems like it should be realistic that if there's coordinated campaigns to threaten the safety of people, that should be absolutely cracked down on and not okay. So that's not the magic wand. That's the like common sense, like, are we really here right now?
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to turn to audience questions in just a moment, but we've been talking a little bit about change the terms here and there. My organization, Free Press, along with Color of Change and Muslim Advocates are the organizations on the call right now who are leaders of the coalition. So I'm going to ask first Madiha and then Brandy to give us just a few minutes on what is Change the Terms, calling for, and why.
Yeah, so Change the Terms as a campaign is, as Jessica mentioned, sort of is a collaboration of different groups that have come together and recognize that there's obviously some value in an open and free internet, but that with it comes the ability for individuals to engage in hateful activities sort of at an extremely large scale given the access to internet platforms. Keeping all of this in mind, Change the Term sets out a framework for how technology companies can address a whole host of issues that come up with respect to their particular company and the platform that they have or the company and product that they have. The campaign urges technology companies to adopt a set of recommended terms covering areas including improved enforcement, rights of appeal, increased transparency, training, governance and authority, and banning state actors, bots, and troll campaigns. And I think what's really, really compelling about this idea behind Change the Terms and what brought people together is that many of us had been working on issues related to our communities and the way in which they were being pushed to the limit for what they were seeing on the platforms. And Change the Terms embodies this coalition effort to bring so many different groups together. We've seen so many different groups already support Change the Terms, and we want technology companies to see that adopting policies like this, adopting recommended terms like this, will only serve to improve the overall experience of the platforms and the products that they provide. And there was a lot of thought put into how the recommendations were put forth in order to address a wide range of different products and a wide range of different tools that these companies provide to their users. So it's an ongoing campaign, and I'll stop there and turn it over to Brandy so she can add to that.
Yeah, I feel like Medea pretty much nailed it. But to add a little more to that in terms of the context, I think, you know, as folks have said, we were kind of tired of being told that there was nothing that could be done by tech companies to protect our communities. We were tired of being decentered from discussions around how best to deal with hate crime and content that's directed towards our communities. And it's so strikingly clear that current policies and enforcement mechanisms were not built with marginalized communities in mind, even though we over-index on their platforms and they need our business to exist. And so what's great about Change the Terms is that you know, there's a lot of folks that were involved in the development of it, but it's actually comprised of around 50 civil and human rights organizations, predominantly people of color and or religious minorities, that believe that tech companies need to do more to ensure they're doing their part to help combat hateful content on their platform. One thing that I did want to also be sure to read is that really double click on is that there was a lot of conversations that really went into this. There were a lot of thought leaders that we talked to here and abroad, and it was really important for us to get this right. This is a product of, I think, almost a year worth of discussions, and I think some of that is crystallized by even us offering a definition of hateful activities. And so the term hateful activities explicitly refers to activities that incite or engage violence, intimidation, harassment, threats, defamation, targeting, an individual or group based on their actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, immigration status, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. So it's like a mouthful, right? And there's so much in there, but like it was really important to us, to the extent possible, that we could wave like some sort of coalition magic wand, that we really tried to get this right and represent so many of the communities that are harmed on and offline.
Thanks to you both so much. For those who would like more information, there is great detail at changetheterms.org. At changetheterms.org, you as an individual can sign a petition to tech companies asking them to adopt these model policies to disrupt hate online, or your organization can sign up to become a member of the Change the Terms Coalition. Just one follow-up question to either Madiha or Brandy, whoever wants to grab it on this. I know there was a lot of thought given to how these policies work together. I mean, Madiha covered, the different, there's a definition for hateful activities, which Brandy read out and Madiha covered. We went into great detail about how the policies would be enforced to ensure equity, right? Because as Brandy brought up in her initial remarks, content was being removed from Black activists that were speaking out against racism, but not from white supremacists who were actually engaging in racism. And so there was a lot of thought that went into how folks should be trained, what kind of content and cultural competency training was required. And I know, you should both remark on this, but I think the thought was that we can't just take one policy and run with it. This is a holistic approach and we got to run together. Can you speak to that at all? Maybe Madiha and then Brandy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. One of the biggest concerns that we have is what I sort of alluded to before, which is that we need to see systemic change. One policy that seeks to address a concern raised by one advocacy organization 2 years ago isn't going to solve the problem. There is an overarching theme that we have seen with interactions with many of these companies, which is that, for one, a lot of the work that we're seeking to have them change, or like our efforts that we're putting forth are pushing them on particular issues, but it's very slow moving to see action from them, or any action at all. In many instances, we won't see anything. And so the idea of putting forth a cohesive and a comprehensive look at recommendations for what they can do to do more and do better, which all of us are seeking them to do, will, I think, help them. It facilitates this conversation in a more open way to get them to think holistically about why we need why we need them to change their policies and their practices across the board. The other small piece that I want to mention before Brandy jumps in is that there's been consistent effort by the companies, and we talked about this already, to keep these conversations separate. And by coming together as a campaign where a number of different organizations are endorsing and supporting this effort, it allows us to have a little bit more control over the conversation on our terms and in a way that we see effectively. And the issue that there's a lack of diversity within the companies is very clear when we have these conversations, and we look at all the organizations that are around the table and we look at the representatives of the companies, and we need them to think really strategically about how to make sure the institution is representative of their global diverse users that they have.
Thank you so much. And I'm actually going to take this back because we're really running short on time, and I'm going to come right back to you, Brandy. No, don't say sorry. That was beautiful, Madiha. I am going to move us into the audience Q&A. We do not have time to answer all the dozens of excellent questions. Please do put them in the chat, and our representatives will try to respond to you as much as we can. But I want to start with you, Brandy, but open this up to the whole panel because this question came up a couple of times in the registration links that, excuse me, the questions that came up through the registration page, is change the term censorship. What is the right balance between free speech and hate speech? So we'll start with Brandy, but I'd like to let everyone jump in.
So short answer is no. Also, plus 1,000 to what Anna said earlier. Like, I feel like she really said a lot of great things in there that I would double click on. But I think also this is a bit of a red herring argument, just because the First Amendment is explicitly about safeguarding dissident voices, religious minorities, and journalists from being snuffed out by government overreach. Explicitly, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's all it says. So I personally find it disingenuous when companies hide behind this framework in order to justify turning a blind eye to the daily discrimination and violent activity that either occurs on or facilitated by their platform, especially when free speech, as framed in the US, as Anna alluded to, operates on this sliding scale, with it being most free for those that can afford the cost from a societal, emotional, and financial standpoint. What's also true is that freedom of speech does not now, nor has it ever, granted the right to amplification. So if you want to go down to the White House and shout about MAGA country until you pass out, you can do that. But Twitter does not have to put a blue check by your face and recommend your vile tweets to others. Facebook doesn't have to live stream your diatribe about killing dreamers. PayPal doesn't have to process the credit card you're trying to use to buy bullets dipped in pig's blood to go after Muslim people. And Amazon does not have to sell your uncopy edited, self-published piece calling for the extermination of Black people. They can all make the choice to say, this is not okay. I don't want your blood money. Life holds more value to us than your trash words. And I think that's what we're asking them to do. Like, you don't get to make money off of my dead body. That's not a guarantee to you. And while we don't think this is easy, the truth is that in places like Germany and other countries, there are guidelines around what's acceptable content that many of these companies already have to adhere to. There's a certain set of standards out there, so it's not an impossible ask, and I think there are lines that can be drawn.
Anyone else like to jump in there? Thank you, Brandy.
So, oh my goodness, that was brilliant. Thank you, Brandy. I'm thrilled to get to hear that. I just had maybe one or two comments just to add, minor compared to what Brandy was saying. But in terms of like the question about the balance between free speech and hate speech, I would add that, you know, until we seriously entertain this as a question, we won't get to a working answer. And moreover, hate speech is actually tipping the balance because we're seeing it being weaponized right now. I would also suggest that the overarching question might actually be, how do we balance free speech with the rights of all people to be free and to be safe?
Well said. Shall we move to the next question, or Madiha or Jess, would you like to get in there? Okay, I'm going to move us to another question that came up early in the queue. What are some ways that people can be good allies to people who are targeted by this type of far-right extremism? And we'll go with the order that we started the webinar. So we'll go from Anna to Madiha to Brandy to Jess.
Can I actually ask that you go backwards? I feel like you have...
Let's go backwards. Jess to Brandy to Madiha to Anna. You're keeping us on our toes, aren't you, Anna?
I apologize. I'm having some rural internet woes. Could you repeat the question for me?
The question is, what are some ways that people can be good allies to those who are targeted by far-right extremism?
I could speak to my personal experience, which was, you know, having people come onto my property and follow me around. It really mattered that we ended up getting schedules of people that just like showed up. They stayed over at my house. They were the ones who were in charge of getting up in the middle of the night if something made a noise or the dogs went off. That way I could try to get some sleep. going on road trips, so at least it could justify, you know, we could document more effectively, and I wasn't all up in my head about whether it was really happening or not, but that guy was sitting there taking notes about my meeting and what was said. We also got a lot of solidarity fundraising, and that really mattered a lot for us because that was the way that we could really create some real security systems. And frankly, we bought cars because driving personal vehicles or using beater donated vehicles that break down all the time wasn't safe. And that wasn't possible unless people donated very generously to help us create those mechanisms of safety.
Brandy?
Sure. I mean, I think there's two different things here. I think one, I think it's really important to follow the lead of frontline communities in different moments. Like different people know how to take care of their own communities and have been doing so for many, many generations and years. And oftentimes I feel like part of where these companies get in trouble and you know, groups get in trouble is trying to put like a sort of paternalistic spin on things and to say that they know what's best and not actually listen to the communities that say this is what's happening. I think we've seen that in a number of different policies that have backfired on these companies when they've been done without actually talking to the groups that are more impacted by them when they fail. So I think that's like one piece of it, but at the same time, it can't just be left to us to do the hard work, right? I mean, I think I've been in enough homogeneous spaces, and every now and again, you know, there's that guy that you know is just one beer too many from saying something problematic he can't come back from. And then it's always like, let's turn to the woman or the person of color or the person, you know, leave it to other people to call out. And I always wonder if it would be called out at all if that person wasn't in the room. And so I think oftentimes silence can be taken as condoning something, and I think people need to be more comfortable condemning what they see, and that should be true both on and offline.
Yeah, plus 1,000 to letting impacted communities lead. That's such an important point. And yeah, speaking out against the silence. So Madiha.
Yeah, I know we're short on time, so I'll just echo that. And one other thing I was going to say is that we see too many folks are making excuses and finding avenues to give them a pass. And I think we're far beyond the time where that's okay now, and we can't continue to make excuses. So whatever avenues and platforms you have to voice concerns and to sort of stand in solidarity with those communities and the advocacy organizations that are leading on behalf of their communities, we really urge you to do that.
Thank you. Anna?
So co-sign what everybody else has said for sure. One of the things that I would just add to that, so looking at this just on the very personal level, is for, you know, people who are loved ones, allies, coworkers, and so on, to step up in terms of like what we understand of trauma and trauma stewardship. There's loose connections in my head anyway, but in terms of thinking about Christchurch and then the subsequent suicides, people connected to both Parkland and the Newton shootings, like these things are all very, very connected. These things live on in people's psyches and hearts and bodies for, you know, years, if not generations. And so to really, like, we culturally, I think, can do a lot more in terms of like caring for each other and better understanding what trauma is in order to be able to lay some of it aside and quiet it down so that people aren't always like really, you know, so at risk, essentially.
Y'all are giving me goosebumps. That was really powerful. Thank you so much for closing us on behalf of Free Press and the Change the Terms Coalition. Thank you so much to the presenters for being here, to all of you who are watching and participating from around the globe. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry that we did not have more time to get to questions. If you want to take action, please visit changetheterms.org. There you can sign our petition to tech companies and sign up your organization to endorse the campaign. For Zoom participants, when we end this webinar, you should be able to be directed to that site. And for those of you watching on Facebook Live, again, please go to changetheterms.org for more information. Thank you to this amazing panel, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Bye.